really been thinking about lately, as I've been looking at, like, I guess the way discourse is handled in other games, and, like, you know, other games that, you know, might have, like, a competitive scene, or aren't strictly PvE. Something that kind of made me realize something with Warframe is how hard it is to have discourse about whether or not an item or a Warframe or a weapon is quote-unquote good, right? There's a couple reasons for that. The main one is that, again, obviously, it is because the game is PvE, so there's no real pressure to have a metagame. It's a lot of, you know, individuality. Like hell, I would barely call this, like, a co-op game, because it's more just like 4 people playing the same game in one space, you know? There's very little reason to interact with one another in a given mission. Outside of, like, you know, buffing each other for one reason or another. But again, no, like, no competition, no, you know, no PvP, no incentive structure in that sense, means that there's no reason for a quote-unquote metagame to evolve. And I think that that is one of the primary reasons why Warframe is so hard to talk about, like, if something is objectively good or not. Because in theory, every, you know, piece or item in the game can do content. And it's like, can some do it more efficiently than others? Yes, but, like, there's kind of this threshold in Warframe where it's like, okay, yeah, this does 1 billion damage, but this other one does 2 billion damage. So yeah, that one's technically better, but, like, does that extra billion on top of your 1 billion, or, like, make the difference? No, it doesn't, because they're all dead anyway. So it's like, the high end is too high end to realistically compare to each other, and there's not a lot of low end to speak of. So defining what is good in this game is so difficult, because I feel like a lot of people have their own metrics as to, like, how they would judge a weapon. It's like, oh, is it easy to build and effective for low investment? Then, like, oh yeah, like, this weapon is going to be better than this other one, even if it maybe has, like, a lower ceiling, right? Like let's just, like, make up an example, a hypothetical scenario. Let's take the MK1 Strun, right? And then we'll take the Brat. Okay, so say, like these are the contentious weapons right now. And while people will argue, well, the Bratton is easier to build, you only need to put 1 Forma in it for it to be effective at what it does, so therefore the Bratton is better. But if you were to put an equal amount of Forma into the Strun and Bratton, the Strun might come out on top. And there are people who judge whether a weapon is or not is good that way. Which I think is really fair, because it's like, oh, well, if every weapon can do 1 billion damage, it's more about which weapons can hit that 1 billion damage with the least amount of effort, and I think that that's a fair assessment. But I personally don't like to view it that way. I think that that's a little bit of a narrow way of thinking. And I know that there's a lot of people, I think that that's actually, like, a pretty common sentiment, is that, you know, if the easier it is to build, you know, the quote-unquote, the better it is. Because, like, you look at what the Torrid does, right? And it's like, yes, what the Torrid does is very strong, comparative to a lot of its contemporaries, but I don't think the Torrid realistically has a, like, the highest ceiling of any weapon right now. I don't think that's true at all. I think that the Torrid is the easiest... It is a crossover of the easiest and strongest weapon currently. Which is why it's favored. But I do think that, again, depending on how you look at it, there are weapons that can beat it out. I think the Latron is really strong, the Strun Prime is really strong. I do think the kit gun, the tentacle kit gun is really, really strong. It is very much like the turret and has some advantages over it, like not having a downtime. And also, I think it has a higher disposition. I'm not entirely sure on that one. Don't quote me on that. If it doesn't, I eat dick. And back to my point, though. I think that's why the turret is so dominant at the moment, and why people say, "Oh, it's the best weapon," because it's, you know, it is the highest ratio of investment to reward that you can have for a singleton weapon. But again, like I said, that doesn't necessarily mean that the turret has the highest ceiling for a weapon, which is where you really start to have to ask yourself, you know, is it really the best? If investment was not a factor, how would our perception of warframes and weapons change? I think that's a very huge consideration that not a lot of people think about. Is that investment isn't always, you know, an indicator of, oh, is this actually the best? It makes you stop and consider. And also, the other side of why this is a really hard discussion to have is because a lot of people play at very different levels of the game, you know? Some people only play it, like, only play at base path. Some people don't even have skill path necessarily unlocked, and yet they participate in discussion, and I think that, you know, what is good for them might not be good for, you know, people who are on skill path, and I think that that is still a valid thing, you know? Oh, is this weapon, like, super accessible and good, and does it work for, you know, base path better than, you know, investing in, say, like, I don't know, a Zaw or something compared to, like, oh, a random prime melee? I think that there's arguments to be made there, and I think that it's both equally valid. And then, like I said, you have the other end of the spectrum where there are people who play for level cap, and like, that's a lot more extreme, where level cap has so much more cutoff for what is considered viable, and people who tend to play around level cap or much higher level content in general tend to have a much narrower view of what is actually good, based more primarily not on investment but the actual ceilings of said option. So that's another, like, divergent aspect of, you know, oh, is this weapon considered good? Well, it's now you have like 5 different answers, and all of them could be completely different because of how varied the spaces are in this game, or like just niches. Like, niches also exist, you know. Eidolon Hunt. I'm sure that Eidolon hunting has specific weapons that are only good there and not necessarily good otherwise. I know for a long time, the Lanka in Eidolon hunting was one of the best weapons for it, but had absolutely no purpose inside the base game, generally speaking, because it just, like, wasn't good for that. It was just good for, oh, this weapon can do a lot of damage with a ribbon, so it fits this specific niche. It has radiation in the base damage, or I think it's electricity. It's either one of those, but it was basically the optimal, ideal stat stick for Eidolon killing. And so the Lanka was top dog for that. Again, I think that that's probably changed by now. I'm sure there's better. Or maybe not, who knows. But that is an entirely separate topic. My point is that there are niches in the game as well that further muddy what could be considered a good weapon or warframe. Because, like I said, this also can apply to warframes too, you know? There's some people who think, oh, well, this warframe is really good, but, like, you know, they may not realize that, you know, oh, it falls off harder in Steel Path. So it's, you know, not nearly as viable for that. And it's because people don't realize, you know, how much harder it is to survive at much higher level. You know, there are people who don't do, like, these long-term survivals and thus don't have that perspective, or don't need to have that perspective, because that's not the content that they do. So maybe their answer is valid for what they do use their choices for. Like, if your only thing is day out and day out, you know, you get in, do your weeklies, get out. Like, I'm kind of in that, but I still do a lot of higher level content, then, you know, like, your answers for what is good and what isn't might change dramatically. Because, like I said, it's not always about the ceiling. But I think either way you look at it, it's so hard to have a conversation of, oh, this weapon is good. Well, oh, well, it's good in what sense? You know, you really have to clarify that, I think, when you are making discussion about, you know, oh, this weapon is good. Well, it's really good. Okay, it's really good for what? You know, I think that should kind of be this, you know, pejorative that we work into our discussions. Pejorative? I don't even know if that's the right word for that. Anyways, I think that's kind of all I have to say on that. But it's something that I've always, like, had in the back of my mind, you know? It's like, whenever I'm making a video where it's like, oh, this weapon is really good. Well, it's like, okay, good by what standard? Like what do people consider good? Because I might consider this weapon really good, but there are people who do entirely different forms of content than me that might think it's, oh, this weapon is bad. And you really have to consider that if you know, if you create content yourself, or again, like I said, you're just having a discussion about it. You have to consider in what context these things are good in.